meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. One of my favorite quotes of U.S. General George S. Patton is concerned with logistics when, wanting to march from Italy to Berlin during World War II, he said, "My men can eat their belts, but I gotta have gas." In today's world, finding gas or petrol isn't hard to do, though paying for it might be. Modern gas stations provide for the needs of the car and the wants of the driver. Fuel, oil, and perhaps a windshield wiper for the car, and a drink or snack for the travelers. To be honest, we take gas stations for granted, as if they were always there to either praise or complain about. Yet, if the good general were to find the gas stations around about that we have today, he would probably have driven his force forward, and the outcome of World War II in Europe would have most likely been resolved much sooner than it historically was. But getting gas to all the cars being built and sold at the turn of the 20th century was just as challenging as building the cars themselves. So let's take a look at how we all started driving with gas. Now, the idea of using petroleum products is actually quite ancient. When Jed Clampett was trying to rustle up some food and, due to horrible aim, shot the ground and up came a bubbling crude, finding oil deposits some 5,000 years ago was even easier than that. Crude oil is, for the most part, understood to be ancient forests that have been compressed and heated through natural means, and over the course of millennia much has been pushed to the surface of the earth. Tar pits like that which can be found at Brea in Los Angeles being just one example, but such natural petroleum ponds could be found across the world, and though they were dangerous, the black gold in them had value throughout known civilization. The black sticky stuff had two notable properties. It resisted water and could catch fire. Thus, the first uses of tar or bitumen or asphalt, whatever your particular vernacular, was for waterproofing things that needed to either hold water in or keep it out. Some 7,000 years ago, it was used to line baskets to make them watertight. Not long after, it was used to seal the hulls of wooden ships to keep them from sinking, which most sailors would agree is a good thing. However, the somewhat flammable nature of the stuff was a problem, and our ancient ancestors experimented with ways to make their water sealant safer when used near fires. Now let's be honest. If you get a big glob of natural tar on fire, you'll be hard-pressed to put it out. It's waterproof by nature, so trying to douse it won't work. And if you just let it burn and hope that the sticky waterproof stuff that you actually want will be left over, you'll be sorely disappointed. Once the uncontrollable fire goes out, all that will be left is a pile of ash. Some other way to purify the product to make it more suitable was needed, and it was some 3,000 years ago in the Middle East and in China that a way to do this, a process we know as distillation, was invented. Here's how it works. Rather than burning the bitumen, put it in a big jar called an albemic and just get it hot enough but not on fire. This will cause the very flammable stuff to become a gas but not actually burn. From there, you direct the fumes into a sort of condenser, a place to let it cool down and go back to a liquid, and then collect the liquid in a separate container. Problem solved. The bitumen is safe around fires, and you now have a nice cup of something on the side. That something is now called kerosene. Also known as naphtha, it was stable, easy to transport, and burned very cleanly. Distilled kerosene quickly became the fuel of choice for lamps, and since crude oil was even more readily available than bitumen, crude was commonly used to distill kerosene and still is to this day. It has even been suggested, though not proven, that kerosene was the accelerant used in the recipe for Greek fire. For the next several thousand years, buildings were illuminated by either candles or oil lamps. Kerosene was commonly used for the lamps, as were also other oils extracted from animal fats, cattle and whales being very common sources of lamp oil. Kerosene is perfect for applications requiring a slow, clean-burning fire. And since internal combustion engines wouldn't become a thing until the 19th century, there was no real need to refine the fuel any further than that. It was in the early 19th century that efforts to make the distilling process more efficient began to develop. The Industrial Revolution in England and elsewhere required large factories with many people working in them, and such buildings needed ample lighting so the workers could see what they were doing. The need for lamp oil skyrocketed, and using the simple distilling presses that had been essentially unchanged since ancient times could not keep up with the demand. Thus the whaling industry boomed, and sailors began to hunt whales on a massive scale, to the obvious detriment of the whales. It was in France that the first major innovations in improving distilling techniques on a large scale came about. It was actually Napoleon Bonaparte himself that led the charge by insisting his nation invent better methods for distilling so as to make the country less dependent on imports. Keep in mind that the process of distilling has applications in agriculture as well as the little general's orders were aimed at that industry. But the infant petroleum industry benefited from these innovations, and so the old albemics were set aside and the column still replaced them. Basically, a column still consists of two towers, filled with coiled pipes, valves, and tanks that are connected together by pipes at strategic locations. Both towers are heated from the bottom, and the resulting vaporized fuel is condensed and collected at the top. This could produce much greater quantities of fuel and do it much cleaner. True, these stills were primarily designed for making wine, but petroleum adopted the same devices. Indeed, it was Aeneas Coffey, an Irishman, who in 1830 invented the modern still. The Coffey still is still a column still with major improvements to its internal workings. It could make wine, beer, whiskey, or whatever alcohol you wanted, and do it with a much higher proof, meaning a higher alcohol content in the resultant beverage, and could make lots of it. With coffee stills, making kerosene could now be done in quantities that made it seriously compete with the whaling industry. But like the whales, crude oil began to become more scarce. Over the next few decades, the pools of crude that could be found dotting the landscape became depleted, and so some new methods of finding and getting it would need to be developed. Thus the oil well was invented. It was in 1859 when engineer Edwin Blake dug the first successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Drake's well and the refinery associated with it produced kerosene at an astounding pace. But there was another byproduct of their distilling process, gasoline. The refinery was of a coffee design, but with a third tower added to make the kerosene even cleaner than the competition. It was from this extra tower that gasoline was collected. Now, to be fair, at the time, he saw no need for gasoline, as it burned too quickly for use in lamps, so he just tossed the stuff. But a need for it was just around the corner. It was at about the same time that the first internal combustion engines were being invented and developed. The first successful one was built by Etienne Lenoir in 1859 and even used to power a primitive motor vehicle. Now, Lenoir's engine was a single-stroke engine. It did not compress the fuel, but rather allowed the natural burn to push the cylinder, and it had firing chambers and exhaust valves on both sides of the piston, thus it being a one-stroke. It ran on kerosene, and since there was no compression of the fuel, it was not particularly powerful, but it would run at a reliable pace. It was Nicholas Otto that created what we now know as the four-stroke engine. For some 13 years, Otto experimented with an engine with only one firing chamber per piston and four distinct engine functions as the piston went up and down: compression, ignition, exhaust, and refuel. When the fuel was compressed, it made the resultant explosion more volatile, thus increasing the power output of the engine. But kerosene doesn't much like being compressed and has a tendency to pre-ignite, which at best could cause a bad knocking in the engine or at worst blow the engine apart, both of which were common in Otto's lab. What he needed for his engine was a fuel that could be compressed without exploding prematurely, which brings up the topic of octane. Octanes are the hydrocarbon molecules that give the fuel its volatility, meaning it makes it burn. Octane rating as we know it has nothing to do with how volatile the fuel is. A low rating fuel produces the same amount of energy as a high octane one does. It's the type and organization of the molecules that establishes the octane rating, which reflects how compressible the fuel is. The lower the octane rating, the less pressure the fuel can withstand before just exploding on its own. Higher ratings will compress much further before spontaneously combusting, and so the timing of when it ignites can be controlled much easier. Kerosene has a low octane rating, around 15, and in a four-stroke engine will ignite long before the engine has compressed it completely, thus causing pre-ignition, knocking, and other damage. Early gasoline had a rating of around 50, And early engines couldn't compress the fuel as much as modern ones, so the piston could complete its compression and the igniter, be it spark plug, hot tube, or whatever, could light off the fuel at the right time. By 1880, oil wells dotted the landscapes of many places around the world. Kerosene was in high demand for lighting and heating, and making high-quality kerosene had gasoline as a byproduct of its manufacture. German chemists, some working with Otto, discovered that gasoline was an excellent emulsifier and therefore great for cleaning up sticky messes. Having found a use for the stuff, hardware stores and apothecaries around the civilized globe began to offer it in tins as a flammable but effective cleaning agent. And then cars showed up. Selling gas as a cleaning agent was doable with the logistics at the time. Fill the small portable tins at the refinery, load them on a wagon, and off they go. The demand was not particularly high volume, so it could be distributed just like any other household cleaner, be it bleach, ammonia, or whatever. But once the 1890s came around and cars started to litter the roads, the demand for gasoline skyrocketed and something had to be done. And it was first done in Russia. A chemist by the name of Vladimir Shukov had an idea for making gasoline as the main product instead of just a byproduct of some other process. He called it thermal cracking, and in simplest terms it uses higher temperatures and pressures to break up the hydrocarbon molecules into smaller pieces much faster than before. This allowed the fuel to be refined more efficiently, and gasoline could now be produced in quantity. And the need for quantity began to soar. Throughout the 1890s and into the 1900s, cars with gas engines were being built and bought in large quantities themselves, and they all needed gas. The thermal cracking process spread throughout Europe and USA as well, with various patents and improvements on the process being made across many countries. Thus, the gasoline industry was born, able to produce the stuff that cars needed to drive and keep up with the demand. However, getting the gas to the driver took a bit longer to sort out. Pipelines began to be built from the refineries to larger transportation hubs or intermodals. France and Russia began such construction in the 1890s, with the USA following shortly after. With pipelines leading to train terminals or large storage tanks along major roads, tanker cars and trucks alike could be filled with lots of fuel for the hungry cars now on the road. Though at first this was done for the most part so as to have the gas put in tins elsewhere and be able for sale off the shelf, it worked, but was cumbersome at best, as filling up the tank meant buying individual gallons or liters of gas and dumping them in one by one. There had to be a better way, which leads us to the gas station. The concept was this: have a store that was specifically designed to provide fuel for a car. True, gas could be found in tins at various stores of the day, but filling your tank that way wasn't particularly convenient. Having a metered pump that could dispense exactly how much gas you want, on site that you could just drive up to, fill up and go, was what the public wanted. And the first one to be built in the world was in St. Louis, Missouri in 1905. Over the next few years, they sprang up all over the USA and into Europe, while also expanding their offerings. Gasoline, of course, but also oil, tires, and even engine service garages. By the beginning of World War I, gas stations could be found in most major cities across the world. To be fair, these early gas stations were not particularly concerned with the creature comforts of the driver. They focused on refueling the car and providing additional mechanical services to the extent that they could muster. These were the grandfathers of modern gas stations and did not have travel plazas, fast food restaurants, and other facilities we are familiar with today. But they did have gas, and regardless of our grousing over the price of it, neither us nor General Patton can get our jobs done without it. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.